everybody can hear me and see the screen I'm sharing. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm really pleased to have been invited to present these findings. We've been working on this for a while. It's with colleagues Ian Lee from UWA and Paul Koshy from Curtin. I don't know if you can see the dates at the very top of the accepted and received and accepted dates for the article, but it was almost a year from when we first submitted till we finally got it over the line. So we're very happy to have it published, and it is open access if anybody would like to get a copy of it, or please just email me. I'm also coming to you or speaking to you on Whadjuk Noongar land, so I share my acknowledgement of them as traditional owners and pay my respects, as David did. So why are we interested in parents' expectations? Before I go into that, I just want to a note on terminology. We'll probably talk a bit interchangeably of aspirations and expectations. So these are subtly different, even though I might use them interchangeably. So generally aspirations are seen as, what we would like without any consideration of constraints being faced, whereas expectations are more sort of realistic. So they're associated. Expectations are aspirations, but moderated by the barriers or the constraints that people face. So why are we interested in parents' expectations about their kids going to university? We've got international evidence shows that parents' views on their children's educational futures actually correlate strongly with the eventual outcomes. We also note there's very clear intergenerational gradients in outcomes. So children who are born into higher socioeconomic backgrounds have better outcomes, and that's transmitted through generations. But we're not all that clear exactly on the causal links that cause that intergenerational transmission. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first ever paper that's been able to look at how Australian parents' expectations correlate with their children's actual outcomes later in life. And the really big question for us as researchers is whether or not there's a causal link, whether parents having higher expectations or aspirations actually causes the children to have better outcomes. So I'm going to be a bit of a spoil sport and confess we can't say anything about that in this paper, and we don't try to do that. But there's good reasons to believe that there is a link. There is international evidence that suggests this. For example, where parents have higher expectations or aspirations, they might invest more in their children's education in secondary school, which leads to better outcomes. And the implications of what I'm about to present, they're much more profound if there is that causal link. But unfortunately, we can't as yet say anything about that in this paper. So if this is true that there's a causal link, a number of people have written sort of suggestions that we can use this as a policy lever by looking at disadvantaged groups and trying to raise the aspirations of parents from, for example, lower income, lower socioeconomic status background families. Then we can improve the children's outcomes. While a number of other people have sort of argued that there's not actually that much evidence of these low aspirations. But they're just some of the reasons that we're interested in parents' expectations. And certainly I think we've got some quite unique data here that offer some really interesting insights into how family background and other factors relate to children's eventual educational outcomes. So just quickly to talk about the data. The data comes from, it's a bit of a mouthful, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, or commonly known as HILDA. So this is a household panel survey that they commenced in 2001 with a big survey of households, and within those households, every person who's age 15 and over is directly interviewed. As we've now got, when we did the paper, we had 19 waves of the data, so from 2001 through to 2019. So children within those households aren't surveyed, but we know they're there. They're enumerated in the survey, so we know what children are in the household, and we know basic demographics like their age and gender and so on. And once they turn 15, they then start responding to the survey in their own right as responding person. So in the HILDA survey, on a rotating basis, they have special modules that are repeated typically on a cycle of 4 years. And one of these is the Education Skills and Abilities module. So it was first included in 2012 and then repeated in 2016. And in that module, parents are asked a whole lot of questions about every child age 4 and above that's going to school. And these are things like the grades attended, the type of school, fees paid, satisfaction with education, academic achievement, and so on. So every child in the household that's at school, those questions are completed by one parent. We've limited the sample to children aged 4 to 15 because once children are over 15, generally they're in years 11 and 12, and their higher education pathways are largely determined, right? They've made subject choices and decisions that relate to their pathway. So we just look at children up to 15, or the expectations for children up to age 15. So you can see we've got, this is the main question on expectation. It's, do you think that this child will go to university when they finish schooling or at some time in the future? And there I've just got the descriptive data. You can see the response categories that the parents are given, from no, maybe, yes, probably, to yes, definitely. And you can see we've got just under 3,000, we've got responses for just under 3,000 children in each wave. And you can see that over 60% of over 60% of those children, parents thought they would probably or definitely go to university, right? So they seem quite optimistic. We know that in reality, about 40% will go to university, but parents think, 60% will probably go or definitely go. So if we take that scale of no through to yes, definitely, taking that as 1 through up to 4 as a crude way of making comparisons between groups, we can just take the mean of that scale from 1 to 4. And this shows you the patterns for by gender and by age. So you can see that parents typically think girls are more likely to go on to university. And you can see it looks like there's a slight decline in expectations as children get older, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. So one of the things, because these are repeat surveys, it's a panel survey, so the questions are asked after 4 years, a lot of those observations are repeat observations on the same child. So we can actually look at how expectations have changed over time. So of those 5,800 odd observations I showed in the previous table, about 3,200 of those come from 2 observations on 1,600 children. So we've got repeat observations. So we can see how these expectations change over time. So this is the expectations conditional on what parents said in 2012. So I actually can't see that. I'll just move this aside. So you can see that in 2012, where parents said, yes, definitely, that they would go to university, about 60% of them said yes, definitely again 4 years later in 2016. And only 5.3% had changed their mind. But if you go down the other end, where back in 2012, the parents said, no, my child won't be going to university, there's only less than 3% have changed their mind, or their kids have convinced them that they actually are going to go to university. And the majority of them, 60%, are still saying no. So these expectations are actually quite stable over time. As you would expect, there's a bit more variation in the sort of less definitive categories in the middle, but generally the expectations are quite stable. And as you would expect, one of the main determining factors is how well the parent thinks the child is doing at school. And I do actually have some great news for you about our education system. The parents were asked how well the children are doing on a 5-point scale, ranging from well below average through to well above average. And almost all children are performing above average in the Australian education system. So that's great news. Of course, mathematically, it's not actually possible, but in fact, 93.2% of parents think their child is performing average or above average. So you can see the expectations for going to university conditional on how well parents think their children are going at school. So for those well below average, because there's so few below average, we had to amalgamate the below and the well below averages categories together to get enough observations. But you can see only 6.7% of children assessed as performing below average were thought that they were definitely going to university. at the other end, 55% who are well above average parents thought they were going to university. So really steep gradient associated with current school achievement. And looking at the other way around, the blue bars, where parents think their children are doing well above average, hardly anyone thinks they're not going to go to university, but almost 50% do if they're performing below average. So that's one of the main factors. Now, this, we think, is the first data that we've ever had that where we can actually look at how parents' expectations actually relate to later outcomes. So we can only do this for a relatively small sample. We got 600 or so that we can look at this, but for the children who were aged 13, 14 or 15, when they were asked in when the parents were asked in 2012 whether they'd gone to university, we could look at whether or not they had by age 20. If you remember, the question actually says or later in life, so some of them might go on, but this is a pretty good guide as to look whether the parent's assessment is right by seeing whether the child hadn't been enrolled at university at any time up until age 20. And this shows you the accuracy. So you can see roughly 70 to 80%, where the parents said the child's definitely going to go to university, but roughly 70 to 80% did go to university, had actually gone. Whereas down at the other end, where the parents said, no, my child won't go to university, only around 4 to 5% did. The other really interesting thing to note is that these seem pretty iffy. So parents are pretty well on the money about who's going to go to university or not, and they seem to be just as accurate for kids age 13 as they are age 15. So I reckon if we went back further in time, to age 12, to age 11 and so on, and remember the expectations are pretty stable, then we'd be getting a pretty similar pattern. So basically parents have a pretty good idea who's going to go to university from pretty early on, even, in primary school. The other thing that's really interesting with this data is that we looked at who thought their child would go to university, but got it wrong by age 20. So they said, yes, my child will go to university, probably or definitely, but turned out the child didn't. By and large, the people who are more likely to make that error were people from groups we know are disadvantaged in education. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, lower socioeconomic status, living in regional areas, parents who rent rather than own their own home. So things that are related to disadvantage in access to higher education were more likely to say that their children are going to go to university, but wrong. So this seems completely inconsistent with the idea that it's actually their aspirations that are holding those groups back, right? If anything, they have higher expectations and don't realise the full impact of the barriers, the actual constraints that they face. They have unrealistically high expectations in face of those barriers, which is inconsistent with a lot of the narrative about aspirations. So that's pretty well my descriptive overview of the data. We also did some multivariate modelling. I'm not going to, given the time constraints, I'm not going to go into that in detail. Basically, it's a model where we model the chance of the parent getting a higher assessment on the scale or more likely that their child will go to university. And that's the dependent variable. We've got a whole lot of control variables relating to the family background, wealth, parents' education, and so on. So lots of really nice control variables in Hilda regional, where people live and so on. So the main results from that multivariate modelling, it confirms that child's current school achievement or the parents' perception of that are the most critical factor. Both mothers and fathers rate girls as being significantly more likely to go to university. But that gender gap is more pronounced for mothers. So fathers actually tend to be more optimistic about their boys going than mothers are, but both mothers and fathers are more optimistic or more likely to expect girls to go. Now, there's a really strong effect of if the parents have enrolled their children at a private school as opposed to a government school, they're substantially more likely to expect them to go to university. And this applies for both Catholic aligned private schools and independent private schools. There's very strong gradients with parental education. So, the more educated, particularly university educated, the parents are, the more likely they are to expect their children to go to university. There's not so much of an effect of occupation once we've controlled for school achievement and parental education and so on, with the exception that parents who work in technical or trade occupations are significantly less likely to think their children are going to go to university. And our best explanation for that is that those parents who have gone through the vet and industry training sector are more likely to think, well, that's a realistic option for my child, or have a stronger preference for vet and industry training sector. There's a very strong and positive effect of parents being born overseas in a non-English speaking country. So compared to where the parents are born in Australia, there's no difference between them and parents who are migrants from an English speaking country. But if the parents come from a non-English speaking country, they're much more likely to expect that their children are going to go to university. Another interesting thing, we found that a lot of the effects are much more pronounced than boys for girls. So you look at, for example, the negative effect of living in a rural area on expectations. This is much stronger for boys than it is for girls. And we think the reason for that is that boys just have more alternative pathways. Not that girls don't have access to those pathways, just statistically they tend not to take them. Boys have a much wider range of pathways that they tend to follow. So if you think about the parents facing constraints, whether it's income or distance to university or whatever it is, and there's a realistic opportunity or a well-established alternative opportunity for boys, those constraints are more likely to affect their assessment for the boys. But for girls, it seems university is pretty much the primary expectation or pathway. Now, we did look at effects for sole parents, and it's very clear sole parents are less optimistic about the prospects of their children going on to university, but it's not that simple a story. One thing is that you notice that the chance of the expectation of children going to university sort of declined marginally as the children got older. That actually only applies for children from sole parents. We don't observe that for children in couple households. And my best guess as to why that is that when you're a single parent, there are significant constraints and barriers that you do face, educating your children and so on, finance, etc. So when children are young, then those parents are probably hopeful or thinking that things are going to get better by the time they're age 14 or 15 and getting close to university. Whereas as time goes on and you're a sole parent and your child's in sort of age 15 now, those barriers are very real. So we think those constraints just become a bit more biting as the children get closer to university age, and we don't see that for children that live in couple families. The other interesting thing is it's not being a single parent per se that is, I've got to, just because of the sample size, we only model this for mothers. So I'm really talking about single mothers, but they may well apply for fathers as well, but the sample's much smaller. But that difference between single and married mothers can be accounted for by the other variables, like financial status, education, where you live, and so on. Some of that might be an effect of being in a single parent family, so that might affect school achievement, which in turn affects expectations, but they are accounted for other variables. But secondly, the expectations are equally low for mothers who are married to men with low levels of education, so just year 12 or lower. So it seems it's not actually the absence of a partner per se, it's the absence of an educated partner, which reduces the prospects or the expectations for children in sole parent families. So finally, just what I think of perhaps some of the key takeaway messages. So it seems from this data that future education prospects are already strongly formed through factors and processes that are clearly apparent to parents by age 13, probably quite a bit earlier. And current school achievement is critical. So it follows from this that if you want to achieve equity for groups that are disadvantaged and go on to higher education, it has to start early, right? You have to address school achievement early on because things are pretty well, not set in stone, but they're pretty well on their way by the time children finish primary school early. So you've got to assess school achievement from early on. Now, all the results are consistent with expectations having a causal effect, but to repeat, we can't say that. We have no actual, it's very hard empirically to show that. But, oops, sorry, I did that accidentally. So, and particularly case in point is the non-English parents from non-English speaking backgrounds, right? They not only have much stronger expectations our kids will go to university, but we know from other data, those children are also much more likely to go to university. For some, Taiwanese and so on, double the likelihood as Australian-born kids. So there has to be somehow these children must be, so those aspirations or expectations somehow must be passed on to the kids. Whether they internalise them, whether it's role models, whether it's a parent's behaviour, but, it seems to me that, it just follows that there is some sort of causal effect. So we saw that even after accounting for school, controlling for school achievement, parental education and going to a private school has a big positive increase on expectations. So this seems to be very likely mechanisms for passing on socioeconomic gradients, right? Kids from wealthier parents who are more highly educated and who are typically go to private schools, not all students in private schools, but statistically that's very clear on average. And they're then going to have better outcomes. So these stand out as potential mechanisms for how advantage is passed on parental education and enrolment at private schools. And just as I repeated before, our data just are not consistent with this idea that it's low aspirations that are holding back groups who we know have lower access to higher education. If anything, rather than low aspirations, they underestimate the barriers that their children face in progressing to university. So in my view, policy really needs to actually address those actual barriers, not to try and change aspirations without addressing those barriers. So sorry, I don't know how I went for a time, it's a little bit rushed, but thank you very much for listening and hope to take some questions.
That's been brilliant, Mike. Thanks so much. I've been enthralled, and I think that it's just been really fantastic hearing you and talk about this research, and I've learned a great deal. I think the questions are coming through in the chat, I'm really pleased to say. I'm just going to start with Leanne Watts, who asked, do you have any data about dropout rates of children who go on to attend university?
Not in this paper, but that data is available, and I have previously looked at lots of different aspects of that. For example, we know that kids who go to private schools are more likely to get into university, but once they get there, they don't do any better and just as likely, if not more likely, to drop out than kids from government schools. We know the ATAR is, a lot of people say the ATAR is a waste of time and should be scrapped. ATAR is actually a very good predictor of your likelihood of completing. So we don't have this data, but that in this study, we don't have that data. As children go on through Hill to become respondents, we can observe whether they go to university, whether they get get a degree, so finish that course. But it's not something we've looked at in this context.
No, that's great. And Leanne's also got a follow-up. Thanks, Leanne. Saying you talk about barriers. Are there any, e.g. income support, are there any policies, are there any solutions aside from policies to overcome these?
Oh, that's a big question. Certainly the financial support is significant. I'm quite a fan of the HEX model. I mean, I know a lot of people don't like it, but as Bruce Chapman, the designer, pointed out, basically the system used to be a system where essentially the kids of wealthy parents got to go to university, and then which was paid for by the taxpayer, and they went on and then earned high incomes. So I think the HEX system is a lot fairer. The other policy is certainly career advice. Is important, making sure people have good advice about the appropriate pathways to take. And again, that's some research that we have done that showed that there's a bit of a socioeconomic gradient in the access that children get as far as careers advice. So children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and who go to private schools are more likely to get careers advice. And much more like to get advice about going to university than children from lower socioeconomic status.
Great, Mike. And we've got two other questions. I'll probably run together if you can answer them together. From John Tan, he asked, does the data help explain if there's a correlation between a culture's valuation of education, for example, Chinese Confucius style, as a reason for parental expectations? And also Amy Byrne, Dr. Amy Byrne, hello Amy, says, will you be disseminating this research, particularly on aspirations to policymakers, and how will you be doing that?
On the first question, that's a great question, and it's like it could be a PhD thesis in itself. So there is a big literature on the causal effects of culture. I wouldn't want to jump and say anything about cultural sort of, implications of Chinese Confucius culture in this context. But one of the main theories for what we observe about parents from non-English speaking backgrounds is that when they get to a country, so they've left a country, often they get to the host country or the new country, and their qualifications aren't as recognised as they are in the home country. So if you think about a sort of socioeconomic status ladder, they go from the host country where they're sort of in the upper areas of the ladder down to a lower level. And there's a theory that one way they really try to address that and move back up to where they feel they should be is by investing in having a strong preference in education, and they try to pass that on to their children. Dissemination, the paper is freely available on open access, so people can download it. I haven't really, unfortunately, passed it on to policymakers. So my institution does the best they can with tweets and social media and things like that are a bit out of my realm. But also, through forums like this. Unfortunately, the main way we used to present a lot of these results was at conferences and workshops, which all came to a grinding halt soon after we started this research. So I haven't left the state for over a year. But hopefully those sort of forums will pick up things like the annual Australian Labour Market Research Workshop was, a major outlet for these this sort of research, and were very well attended by state and Commonwealth education officials and even ministers sometimes.
That's brilliant. We're going to have to wrap up there, Mike, but we've really appreciated your time and expertise, and we will certainly all be doing our best, I know, to disseminate it. I'm going to thank you from me personally and hand back over to David.